If what is happening to the Mississippi River right now has you paying attention the way it has me, hit like and subscribe to Signal Watch so you don't miss a single update as this crisis develops. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from, what time it is there, and this. Do you live within 100 miles of the Mississippi River system? Because your answer shapes everything about what this event means for you personally. And if you know anyone who farms, who drives truck, who works in agriculture, or who eats food, which is everyone, share this video. They need to see this. X, Facebook, Reddit, group chats. You are why we can keep doing this work. Thank you for being here. Here's what this investigation covers. The atmospheric physics behind a stall blocking pattern that has systematically robbed the Midwest of the rainfall its rivers require, turning the nation's most critical inland waterway into a shallow obstacle course. The specific geometry of the Mississippi River system that means drought in Ohio and Indiana kills shipping in Louisiana, and why that relationship makes the current crisis more severe than the drought maps of the affected states suggest. The exact economic arithmetic of what happens when the cheapest, most efficient freight corridor in the Western Hemisphere loses half its capacity at the peak of harvest season, and why rail and trucking cannot absorb what the river is failing to move. And what the fourth consecutive year of low water tells us about a pattern that is no longer an anomaly. Now, let's get into it. Somewhere along a 400-mile stretch of the Mississippi River between Cairo, Illinois, and Memphis, Tennessee, the water is not deep enough. It is not dramatically shallow in the way that a dry creek bed is shallow. The river still moves. It still looks, from certain angles, like the broad, brown, enormous river that has defined American geography since before the nation existed. But the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers maintains a 9-foot deep, 300-foot wide, navigable channel along the full length of the Mississippi River from Minneapolis, Minnesota to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. A continuous corridor of federally managed water depth that has been the physical foundation of American commerce for generations. When that channel shallows to 7 feet, the economics of barge transportation begin to deteriorate. When it shallows to 6 feet, load restrictions tighten and the number of barges that can be assembled into a single tow shrinks. When the water gauge at Memphis, Tennessee drops below zero, below the reference baseline the National Weather Service uses as its starting point, the system is in crisis. When that gauge reads -9, -10, -11 feet, as it has in recent years, the river is functionally a different transportation system than the one the American economy was built around. The Mississippi River is, without exaggeration, the most economically important waterway in the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers estimates that the river moves 589 million tons of freight annually. The total domestic commerce passing from Minneapolis to the mouth of the river in a single year has been valued at nearly $70 billion. The broader inland waterway system, including the Ohio River, the Missouri River, the Illinois River, and the hundreds of tributaries that feed the Mississippi Basin, moves freight valued at more than $187 billion annually. A single barge carries roughly 1,750 tons of grain. A standard 15-barge tow, a single tugboat pushing 15 barges lashed together, moves as much cargo as 216 rail cars and 6 locomotives, or 870 large semi-trucks. That scale of efficiency, combined with the fact that a barge can move 1 ton of cargo 647 miles on a single gallon of fuel compared to just 151 miles for a truck, has made river transport the economic backbone of Midwestern agriculture for over a century. And that backbone is currently fractured. The Drought.gov Mississippi River Basin Dashboard, a real-time monitoring system launched by the National Integrated Drought Information System in partnership with NOAA, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Coast Guard, and the U.S. Geological Survey, is showing what has now become a familiar and deeply alarming pattern. Low water thresholds being triggered at multiple locations along the river system, load restrictions being imposed on barges, tow size limitations being enforced by the Coast Guard, and the river gauge at Memphis trending toward the negative readings that signal serious disruption to commercial navigation. This is the 4th consecutive year that these conditions have emerged at harvest season, the period when the demand for southbound barge transport of corn and soybeans is highest, when the system needs to perform at maximum capacity to move the American agricultural surplus to Gulf ports for global export. The American Farm Bureau Federation's agricultural transport analysts documented the pattern with precision. In just over a month of a typical recent drought year crisis, total southbound Mississippi river grain shipments fell from 2.4 million short tons to 502,000, a 79% drop. Corn movements fell 72%. Soybean movements fell 89%. Wheat movements fell 55%. Those are not abstract freight statistics. They are the numerical signature of an economic paralysis occurring at the worst possible moment in the agricultural calendar, affecting the food and energy supply of a nation and the export competitiveness of its farmers in global markets. The Mississippi River's water level is not determined by what falls directly on its banks. This is one of the most important and most misunderstood facts about the river's hydrology, and understanding it is essential for understanding why the current drought is creating exactly the crisis it is creating. At Cairo, Illinois, where the Ohio River meets the Mississippi, 90% of the total water that will ultimately flow through the lower Mississippi River and discharge into the Gulf of Mexico has already arrived. The final 10% comes from the St. Francis, White, Arkansas, and Yazoo rivers, which enter below Cairo. What this means is that when a drought affects the Ohio River basin, the drainage system covering roughly 525,000 square miles of Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Tennessee, it does not primarily threaten those states' local water supplies. It threatens the Mississippi River's depth as far south as Louisiana. The Ohio River's normal contribution to the lower Mississippi River's total flow is approximately 50%. When the Ohio basin is in drought, that contribution collapses. In September of 2025, NOAA's drought update for the Mississippi River Basin documented exactly this dynamic. The Ohio River was contributing only 8% of the overall flow to the lower Mississippi, compared to its typical 50%. The river system was receiving a fraction of its expected input from its most important tributary. The atmospheric mechanism that produces this drought pattern has been studied in detail at the University of Missouri, where researchers including Sarah Weaver, Anthony Lupo, and Patrick Geenan have analyzed the relationship between atmospheric blocking events and Midwest drought. Their work presented to the U.S. Cleave, program examining the 2022 and 2023 drought summers, found that during dry years like 2012 and 2022, the dominant atmospheric pattern was a strong 500 millibar geopotential height anomaly, a persistent ridge in the upper atmosphere situated over the central and western United States. This ridge did two things simultaneously. It suppressed convection, preventing the thunderstorm activity that delivers the majority of summer precipitation across the Midwest, and it deflected the storm tracks that would normally bring Pacific moisture systems into the region. The result is what meteorologists identify as a blocked pattern, rather than the normal progression of weather systems moving eastward across the country, driven by the jet stream's westerly flow. A blocking ridge anchors in place. Storm systems that approach from the west are deflected around the block, to the north into Canada, to the south into the Gulf states, without penetrating the high-pressure dome sitting over the agricultural heartland. The agricultural heartland, meanwhile, receives cloudless skies, abundant sun, and essentially no rain, day after day, week after week. NOAA's Climate Prediction Center, Spring 2026 Outlook, issued in March of that year, documented the long-term precipitation deficits across Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, and southern Iowa at 8 to 16 inches over the preceding 12 months. 8 to 16 inches. A normal year in Missouri delivers about 42 inches of annual precipitation. A deficit of 8 to 16 inches represents roughly 20 to 40% of normal annual rainfall missing from the soil profile. That is not a seasonal dry spell. That is a sustained multi-month reorganization of the moisture budget of the entire upper Mississippi and Ohio River basins. A reorganization driven by the atmospheric blocking that has recurred with unusual frequency over the region since 2012. There is a particular cruelty to the relationship between upper basin drought and lower river navigation that is worth examining precisely because it explains why drought conditions in Indiana, a state hundreds of miles from the Gulf of Mexico, can shut down the port of New Orleans. The Mississippi River system is the largest drainage basin in the United States, covering approximately 40% of the contiguous 48 states. Water falling on the western slopes of the Appalachians in Pennsylvania, on the agricultural plains of Illinois and Iowa, on the rolling hills of Missouri and Tennessee, all of it eventually finds its way into the tributaries that feed the Mississippi's main stem. The river basin encompasses some of the most productive agricultural land on Earth: the corn belt of Illinois and Iowa, the soybean country of Indiana and Ohio, the wheat prairies of Kansas and Nebraska. The waterway system that drains this basin is also the highway that connects it to global markets. The physics of how that water travels downstream means that drought impacts propagate slowly. Rainfall deficit in the upper Midwest in August does not immediately translate to low water in Memphis. The water column has momentum, and the dams and locks of the upper river system, 29 on the upper Mississippi alone, managed by the Army Corps, provide some storage buffer. But by October, when the upper Midwest autumn dry period has compounded weeks of subpar rainfall and the Ohio Basin's drought has cut its contribution from 50% to 8%, the lower river has nowhere to get its water from. The reservoir of upstream precipitation that should be sustaining the lower river's depth through harvest season simply does not exist. When the gauge at Memphis reads -9 or -10 feet, the practical consequences for barge operators are immediate and severe. Every 6 inches of draft depth is equivalent to loading approximately 106 short tons of cargo per barge. If barge operators on a deeper draft river segment normally load each barge to an 11.5-foot draft, common on the lower Mississippi, where the Army Corps maintains deeper cuts than the 9-foot minimum standard, and low water conditions force them to limit draft to the 9-foot standard, each barge carries approximately 537 fewer tons than it otherwise would. That is a 36% reduction in cargo per barge. On a 15-barge tow, the reduction is approximately 8,000 tons per tow, the equivalent of roughly 300 additional semi-trucks that must somehow pick up the slack. The tow size restrictions compound the draft restrictions. When the navigable channel narrows due to low water, the physical width of the permitted tow shrinks. The Army Corps and Coast Guard have, in extreme low water events, reduced permitted configurations from the normal 5-wide arrangement of barges to 4-wide or 3-wide, and reduced the number of barges per string accordingly. The Waterways Journal reported that in the 2024 extreme low water event, restrictions were imposed that reduced effective loading capacity per tow by as much as 36% compared to normal operations. When both draft restrictions and tow size restrictions are in effect simultaneously, the standard condition during severe low water events, the effective freight capacity of the river can fall to less than half its normal level, half the capacity of the nation's most important freight corridor, at the peak of the agricultural shipping season, with no alternative transport system capable of absorbing the difference. It is easy to think of the Mississippi River shipping crisis as primarily an agricultural story. It is that. But the river's freight portfolio extends well beyond grain, and understanding the full scope of what moves on it is essential for understanding the full scope of what stops when it stops. The American Farm Bureau Federation puts the barge system's agricultural role in stark terms. Close to half of all U.S. corn, soybeans, and wheat exports move through the Mississippi River system. An average of 65 million metric tons of bulk agricultural product travels by barge to terminals near New Orleans annually, where it is loaded onto ocean vessels bound for global customers. Between 2015 and 2019, 95% of corn, 94% of soybeans, and 45% of wheat that moved by barge at all traveled through the Mississippi River system to Louisiana. This is not a minor transport channel for American agriculture. It is the export pipeline. The competitiveness of American grain in global markets depends directly on the cost of that pipeline. Iowa State University agriculture economist Chad Hart has described the dynamic plainly. When river levels drop and barge rates rise, U.S. farmers become less competitive in the global grain trade because the cost of delivering grain from an Iowa farm to a Brazilian competitor's export terminal is lower than the cost of delivering from an Iowa farm to the Gulf of Mexico. Brazil's agricultural infrastructure, its internal logistics have improved dramatically over the past 2 decades, now positions it as a viable alternative supplier for the same buyers that U.S. farmers have served for generations. When the Mississippi fails, those buyers don't wait. They source elsewhere. But grain is not all that the river moves. The Bureau of Transportation Statistics analysis of Mississippi River freight noted that distillate fuels, diesel, fuel oil, heating oil, ranked second in total shipments on the river above New Orleans. Petroleum products of all kinds moving northward from Gulf Coast refineries to Midwest consumers represent a critical freight category that moves cheapest and most efficiently on barges. Coal for power plants, chemicals for agriculture and manufacturing, fertilizers heading north for the next planting season, steel, cement, sand, and gravel. All of it moves on the river, and all of it is disrupted by low water. The fertilizer component is worth examining specifically because it creates a compound effect on agriculture that extends beyond the immediate shipping disruption. Fertilizer, primarily nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium products, is imported into the Midwest via barges moving northward on the Mississippi and Illinois rivers from Gulf Coast ports. When low water restricts southbound barge capacity, the same conditions restrict northbound barge capacity because the physical constraints of draft depth and channel width apply in both directions. Barges that cannot be loaded heavily with grain heading south also cannot be loaded heavily with fertilizer heading north.
The result is a simultaneous squeeze on both export revenues and input costs for Midwest farmers. Exactly the double whammy that Chad Hart at Iowa State described. Lower prices for their corn and soybeans moving out, higher costs for fertilizer moving in. The Army Corps of Engineers quantifies what the entire inland waterway system saves the American economy annually, approximately $7 billion to $9 billion in transportation cost compared to rail or truck alternatives. At the river's full efficiency, that savings represents the competitive advantage that American agriculture has over countries whose domestic transport infrastructure is less developed. When that efficiency is halved by low water, the savings are halved too, and the costs of American food production and energy distribution rise correspondingly. Before we go further into the economics and logistics of the current crisis, it is necessary to sit with a number that should be alarming to anyone paying attention to it. The Mississippi River at the Memphis, Tennessee gauge has fallen below the zero reference level, the baseline established by the National Weather Service as the normal low point during harvest season in 8 of the last 10 years. Not 3 of the last 10, not 5 of the last 10, 8 of the last 10. The gauge has reached the negative 5-foot threshold, what the National Weather Service defines as the low stage at which low water levels begin to have significant negative impacts on water-related industries 5 times since 2015. In 2015, 2017, 2022, 2023, and 2024. The record low at Memphis was set in October of 2022 at minus 10.79 feet, shattering the previous record of minus 10.7 feet set in July of 1988, itself the product of the catastrophic 1988 drought that was at the time considered a one-in-a-generation event. In 2023, the Memphis gauge reached minus 11.52 feet, a new record low since record-keeping began, surpassing the 2022 mark within a single year. The Waterways Journal, the trade publication of the barge industry, described this pattern in October of 2024 with the weary precision of people who have watched a trend develop over years. Seemingly every year now, river levels are setting or flirting with new record lows at various locations on the river system. The Southern Ag Today publication, produced by agricultural economists at multiple land-grant universities bordering the Mississippi, documented in August of 2025 that the river had fallen below the zero reference point during harvest season in 8 of the last 10 years. Their analysis noted that this was not the 3-peat, the 4-peat, or even the 5-peat that commentary on the shipping crisis had been tracking in previous years. It was the establishment of a new norm, or more precisely, the visible emergence of a pattern so consistent that it demands a different conceptual framework than the one the industry and the public have been using. The AccuWeather analysis published in October of 2025 identified the current situation as the third time in 4 years that drought had been extensive and long-lasting enough in the Mississippi Basin to disrupt normal tug and barge operations. The Soy Transportation Coalition's Mike Steenhoek, one of the most consistently accurate and honest voices on the state of inland waterway transport, told reporters in October 2025 that he had been hoping the system could avoid a 4th consecutive year of low water levels, and found himself, despite genuine spring rainfall optimism, watching the gauges fall again. Because that is quite unique to have multiple years in a row of this. Steenhoek told Investigate Midwest in September of 2024, with a precision that understates the historical novelty of what he was describing. It is unique. The Mississippi River system has experienced severe drought events throughout its history. The 1938 drought of the Dust Dam Bowl era, the catastrophic 1988 drought, the 2012 Great Plains drought, but those were separated by years or decades of normal operation. 4 consecutive years of harvest season low water is something the historical record has not previously produced, and the atmospheric blocking pattern that drives it has not abated. What is also worth understanding is the architecture of the river's role in American life beyond freight. The Mississippi River Basin is home to roughly 70 million people. It provides drinking water to communities across a dozen states. The river's health supports commercial fisheries, recreational industries, and the ecological function of the Gulf of Mexico itself. The Louisiana wetlands that buffer Gulf storms from the coast depend on the freshwater flow the river provides, which maintains the delicate salinity balance of the delta ecosystem. When drought cuts the river's flow dramatically, these non-commercial functions are also compromised.
The saltwater intrusion documented in 2023, when Gulf salinity migrated upstream into municipal drinking water supplies in southern Louisiana, is one expression of what happens when the river's flow falls far enough. The crawfish industry's $139 million loss in that event is another. The shipping crisis is the most visible economic disruption. It is not the only one.
The relationship between river depth and barge freight rates is one of the most direct and brutal cause and effect relationships in American agriculture. When the gauge at Memphis falls, the rate per ton of grain shipped from the Midwest to the Gulf rises, sometimes dramatically, sometimes catastrophically, and that cost does not disappear into the logistics system. It lands on the farmer. The pricing mechanism works through a benchmark tariff system established in 1976. Barge freight rates are quoted as a percentage of that benchmark, so a rate of 300% of tariff in St. Louis, where the benchmark is $3.99 per ton, translates to $11.97 per ton of grain shipped. In a normal year, with water levels sufficient for full loading, barge rates run in the range of 100 to 200% of tariff at St. Louis, competitive, efficient, and far below what it would cost to move the same grain by truck or rail. That is the efficient market that generates the $7 to $9 billion annual savings the inland waterway system provides over alternatives. In October of 2022, when the Memphis gauge reached its record low of minus 10.79 feet, barge rates in St. Lucie reached 3,000% of tariff. The tariff rate is $3.99 per ton. 3,000% of that is $119.70 per ton. In the week of October 11, 2022, barge spot freight rates hit an all-time high of $105.85 per ton in St. Louis. For the week ending December 24, 2022, year-to-date barged grain shipments were 11% lower than 2021 and 6% lower than the 3-year average. From July 2022 through January 2023, agricultural exports through Louisiana ports declined 3.9%, an economic loss of $565 million in the second half of the year alone. The total estimated economic loss from the 2022 Mississippi River drought event was assessed at approximately $20 billion in lost U.S. economic output, according to AccuWeather analysts, $20 billion from a drought affecting a river's depth. The 2012 Great Plains drought, which closed the Mississippi River at least 3 times and produced an estimated $30 billion in direct agricultural losses, was at the time described as a once-in-a-generation catastrophe. The 2022 event produced 2/3 of that damage without the physical river closures, through the slower mechanism of restricted navigation and elevated freight rates grinding the system down over months. In 2023, the Memphis gauge reached a new record low of minus 11.52 feet, and barge rates out of St. Louis reached 2,000% of tariff, lower than 2022's peak, but still 20 times the benchmark and exponentially above the rates at which farmers can profitably market their grain. The Cairo-Memphis benchmark rate peaked at $53.03 per ton in fall 2023, 69% higher than the fall 2021 peak of $31.40 per ton and 148% above the fall 2020 peak of $21.35. By the late summer of 2025, the 4th consecutive year of low water disruption, the American Farm Bureau Federation was documenting Cairo-Memphis shipment rates averaging $18.84 per ton, compared to $14.03 in non-drought years, a 49% premium over normal in St. Louis. Not a crisis level rate, but an elevated one, and with the gauges trending downward through October, a number with nowhere to go but higher as the harvest season accelerated demand against constrained capacity. The mechanism by which these elevated barge rates damage farmers is called basis deterioration. Basis is the difference between the local cash price a farmer receives for grain at a river elevator and the futures price traded on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. In a functioning market, the basis reflects the actual cost of transporting that grain from the elevator to the export market. When barge rates rise, elevators along the river lower their cash bids to farmers to cover the elevated transport cost. The farmer who expected to receive a certain cash price finds that the elevator is offering significantly less. Not because the commodity is worth less globally, but because it costs more to get it to the customer who would pay full price. Hunter Biram, James Mitchell, and colleagues at the University of Arkansas Division of Agriculture have documented this basis deterioration in multiple published analyses of the 2022 through 2024 low water events. Their most striking finding: in Helena, Arkansas, soybean basis during the drought years was not only weaker than the 5-year non-drought average, but in 2025 had fallen to 41 cents below the non-drought average, 25 cents below even the drought year average of recent years. The market was pricing in the disruption before the worst of it had arrived. For an individual farmer, the basis deterioration translates into a specific, calculable income loss. A soybean farmer in southern Missouri growing 2,000 acres of soybeans, A large but not exceptional operation might expect to harvest 60,000 bushels in a normal year, selling to a river elevator at a cash price that reflects a basis of, say, 20 cents above the futures price in a normal market. In a drought year, when basis falls to 40 or 50 cents below the futures price, a deterioration of 60 to 70 cents per bushel, that farmer's 60,000 bushels produces $36,000 to $42,000 less revenue than the normal market equivalent, not from a smaller harvest, from a logistics failure 200 miles downriver. Paul Freeman, a Minnesota soybean farmer interviewed by NPR in October of 2025, articulated the compounding of pressures that this situation creates. He was simultaneously watching the river gauges and weighing whether to market his crop through the Mississippi River export channel or through alternative pathways that offered lower prices. He was also navigating a China market that had been disrupted by trade tensions, China historically being the largest buyer of American soybeans. That's a big question mark this year with all the turmoil in the markets, Freeman told the reporters. He had responded by building new business relationships, including selling specialty soybeans directly to Japanese buyers for the first time, a rational adaptation that also illustrates the energy and resource expenditure that recurrent disruption demands of farmers who should be able to rely on a logistics system and instead find themselves managing its failures. The fertilizer squeeze is the underreported half of the double whammy. American agriculture imports billions of dollars of fertilizer annually, primarily nitrogen in the form of urea and ammonia, potash from Canadian mines, and phosphate from Florida and Morocco. Much of this fertilizer moves northward on barges from Gulf Coast import terminals and domestic production facilities. When low water restricts the southbound grain movement, it simultaneously restricts the northbound fertilizer movement because the draft and tow size restrictions apply regardless of direction. Farmers who need to apply fall fertilizer for the next year's crop, a practice that reduces spring fertilizer application pressure, find the supply chain tightened, the per-ton cost elevated, and the availability reduced at the exact time they need to take delivery. The cost of the river's disruption thus compounds. Lower income from the current year's crop, higher input costs for next year's. Chad Hart's double whammy is not a figure of speech. It is arithmetic. When the river fails, the conventional response is to move freight to rail and truck. This response is correct in principle. In practice, during a severe Mississippi River crisis, it is partially, inadequately, and expensively correct, and the inadequacy is structural. Charles Roth, an analyst at FTR Transportation Intelligence, stated the fundamental problem directly during the 2022 crisis. In order to move the amount of freight that currently is in transit via barge on the Mississippi, it would require an immense amount of capacity that is unique from an equipment standpoint. The trailers required to haul grain versus coal and versus bulk liquids are all different. There's limited options for moving that freight. The arithmetic of the capacity gap is the place to start. A single standard 15 barge tow carries 22,500 tons of cargo, the equivalent of 870 large SEMSI trucks or 216 railroad cars with 6 locomotives. In 2019, more than 65 million metric tons of soybeans passed along the river from Minneapolis to the Gulf of Mexico. Moving 65 million metric tons by truck would require approximately 37 million truck trips annually, roughly 100,000 truck trips per day, every day of the year, just for soybeans, the U.S. Class 1 railroad system, which has been managing its own capacity and labor constraints throughout the same period as the river crises, cannot simply absorb a 15 to 20% surge in bulk grain demand during the harvest months without significant service degradation. The 2022 crisis demonstrated exactly this. In November of 2023, Roll Call's reporting on the river crisis quoted an industry analyst who captured the alternative transport problem with unusual clarity. It could happen, but the nature of where we are now is we have a truck driver shortage and rail cars are booked up. Those constraints, the ongoing trucking industry driver shortage, the railroad capacity and service issues that had been building throughout the 2022 to 2024 period, meant that the natural safety valve for river disruptions was partially closed at the exact moment it was needed. Ingram Barge Co., the largest U.S. barge operator, declared force majeure in October of 2022 due to low water conditions disrupting normal operations through the river, a legally significant declaration that the conditions affecting the river were beyond their operational control. Nucor Corporation, the largest U.S. steelmaker and a major barge shipper of steel from Midwest mills to Gulf Coast markets, announced it would not load barges for several weeks to avoid having material stuck on the river and to ensure on-time delivery to customers. The blockages affected, as one analysis put it, effectively every sector of the U.S. economy, from automobiles to appliances to grocery stores and restaurants. not agricultural products exclusively. The petroleum products, chemicals, building materials, and industrial goods that also travel the river were simultaneously disrupted. Grain elevators along the river faced a specific crisis of their own. Their business model is predicated on buying grain from farmers at one price, storing it, and selling it at another price, with the transportation cost to the market being a key variable in their margin. When barge rates spike to 3,000% of tariff, elevators cannot profitably market the grain they have already purchased. The grain sits. The storage capacity fills. Farmers arriving with more grain at harvest find the elevators either full or offering prices too low to cover production costs. Some grain piled in emergency outdoor storage on farm ground, exposed to weather, subject to quality loss. Some was rerouted to ethanol plants in the Midwest at less competitive prices than export markets would have offered under normal conditions. And some simply waited, with farmers holding inventory and hoping that either river conditions or prices would improve before the carrying costs of storage consumed their margin entirely. The rail diversion that did occur added its own costs and complications. Moving grain by rail to alternative export ports, Pacific Northwest ports on the Columbia River system, Gulf ports accessible without Mississippi River transit, requires different rail car types, different logistics coordination, and longer transit times. The per-ton cost of rail transport for grain is substantially higher than barge. The inland waterway system saves an estimated $7 to $9 billion annually compared to rail and truck, alternatives specifically because barge is so much cheaper per ton mile. When forced to rail, shippers pay those higher costs. Those costs, again, eventually reach the farmer and the consumer. A Mississippi River crisis is not only a Midwest crisis. It is a Louisiana crisis, a Gulf Coast crisis, and ultimately a global trade crisis, because the Port of New Orleans and the South Louisiana Port Complex are the funnel through which American agricultural exports reach global markets. The Port of New Orleans and the associated South Louisiana port area collectively form the largest port complex in the Western Hemisphere by tonnage. The port's economic function during harvest season is straightforward. Grain-laden barges arrive continuously from the upper river. Their cargo is offloaded to riverside elevators and grain terminals, and that grain is then loaded onto ocean-going vessels, Panamax and Capesize bulk carriers, for export to Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and wherever global grain demand exists in that season. When barge arrivals fall, the terminal pipeline empties. The ocean vessels that arrive on schedule to load grain find that the grain has not arrived. They wait at anchor, accumulating demurrage costs, the daily charge for a vessel sitting idle, that are ultimately passed along to the buyers of the grain. The 2022 crisis illustrated the full downstream consequence. By early October, the U.S. Coast Guard reported a backup of more than 2,000 barges at various points on the lower Mississippi. Barges that had departed the upper river with loads constrained by draft restrictions moved slowly through a system operating at reduced capacity and were now queued waiting for their turn at terminals that could not clear their incoming traffic fast enough to stay ahead of the backlog. The river near Stack Island, Mississippi, and near Memphis were temporarily closed, exacerbating the backup. The financial consequences at the Louisiana end are measured in the export statistics. From July 2022 through January 2023, agricultural exports through Louisiana ports declined 3.9% compared to the prior year. $565 million in lost export revenue in just 6 months. Global buyers who could not receive American grain on schedule sourced from Brazil, Argentina, or Ukraine. The U.S. Market share in corn and soybean exports, which had been recovering from trade war disruptions earlier in the decade, took a setback. That market share is not automatically recovered when the river stabilizes. Buyers who found alternative sources may stay with those sources. There was an additional dimension to the 2023 Louisiana crisis that received less attention than the shipping disruption itself. NOAA's drought status updates documented that in 2023, water levels on the lower Mississippi dropped so low that salt water from the Gulf of Mexico began migrating upstream into the freshwater supply used by several parishes in southern Louisiana for municipal drinking water. The salinity intrusion, a phenomenon where the freshwater head pressure that normally pushes back against Gulf saltwater is insufficient, allowing the denser saltwater to creep upstream, forced the state of Louisiana and several parishes to issue drinking water advisories and truck freshwater to affected communities. The crawfish agriculture industry in the affected region lost an estimated $139.8 million as saltwater incursion damaged breeding ponds and altered the aquatic ecosystem that sustains the industry. A drought in Ohio and Indiana produced a drinking water emergency in Louisiana. That is the Mississippi River system at the limit of what its geography permits. Stress applied at one end propagating all the way to the other, through the simple mechanics of a river that is 7% shallower than it should be. The Gulfport infrastructure itself experiences stresses that are less visible than the barge backups, but economically significant. The grain elevator and terminal facilities at South Louisiana ports, the world's largest grain loading complex by volume, are designed around the assumption of continuous barge arrivals. When barge deliveries fall by 70 or 80% during a low water crisis, the terminals are operating at a fraction of their designed throughput. The fixed costs of those facilities, labor, maintenance, debt service on the capital investment, continue accruing whether or not grain is flowing through. The terminal operators manage this through a combination of rate adjustments, inventory draws from prior barge deliveries held in storage, and reduced throughput staffing. But the economics of the system depend on volume, on the scale efficiency that makes per unit costs manageable. When volume collapses, per unit costs rise, and those costs ultimately flow into the bids that the terminals offer for grain deliveries and the rates they charge for loading ocean vessels. The demurrage costs on waiting ocean vessels represent another hidden cost that distributes through the supply chain. A Panamax bulk carrier chartered for grain loading at New Orleans at a daily rate of $15,000 to $25,000. Typical rates for ocean bulk vessels, sitting at anchor waiting for grain that has not arrived because the barges carrying it are backed up or restricted, generates costs that the vessel owner passes to the grain company, which passes them to the elevator, which accounts for them in its basis bid to farmers. Every link in the chain absorbs a fraction of the delay's cost, and every link passes the remainder upstream until it reaches the farm gate. The river is the infrastructure of America's agricultural economy. When the infrastructure fails, the costs do not disappear. They redistribute to the farmer, to the consumer, to the export customer, and to the taxpayer who ultimately funds the Army Corps of Engineers' emergency dredging operations. The current crisis does not arrive in a vacuum. It arrives as the fourth instance in a row of the same disruption, which means it is landing in a system that has not fully recovered from the previous three. Mike Steenhoek of the Soy Transportation Coalition explained the recovery dynamics after the 2022 crisis with the careful specificity of someone who understands the system's logistics. It's very much anticipated you're going to see some of these shippers, whether they're on the outbound side or on the inbound side, still having hiccups or challenges with getting the kind of service that they normally would expect, just because it takes time to get back to normal. He was speaking in early 2023, after the 2022 crisis had begun to ease. Within months, the 2023 crisis had begun. When low water conditions end, when sufficient upstream rainfall finally restores normal river depth, the recovery is not immediate. The barge fleet is not sitting at the ready, evenly distributed along the river, waiting for normal conditions to resume. During a crisis, barges become stranded or are repositioned in ways that reflect the crisis routing rather than normal operational geography. Some barges are far from where they are needed. Some are waiting in queues at terminals. The equipment and crew positioning that supports normal operations must be reassembled from a disordered state. The Army Corps of Engineers dredging program, which runs around the clock during low water periods to maintain the minimum navigable channel depth, needs to be repositioned and scaled back as conditions improve but the specific problem locations shift. The 2025 crisis, the fourth consecutive year, thus arrives into a logistics system that has spent 4 years in a state of periodic disruption and partial recovery, never getting far, enough back to normal to rebuild the operational buffers that a healthy river transport market maintains. Elevator storage that is full doesn't empty between years if the previous year's grain export program was disrupted. Barge operators who have spent 4 years managing crisis operations have deferred maintenance, adjusted fleet positioning for drought normal conditions rather than water normal conditions, and made business decisions based on the assumption that low water is the new normal rather than the exception. The Waterways Journal's industry analysts noted in late 2024 that the barge fleet itself is aging, a long-standing structural issue that the chronic disruption and uncertainty of the past 4 years has made more acute. New barge construction investment slows when the return on that investment is uncertain because operating conditions are unpredictable year to year. The industry's capital formation challenges compound the operational challenges of the river's recurrent shallow water periods. The Army Corps of Engineers is the other compounding factor. The Corps' mission includes maintaining the navigable channel, dredging it to the authorized 9-foot depth when sedimentation or low water threaten navigation. During extreme low water events, the Corps' dredging resources are committed around the clock in crisis mode, in locations where the water has gotten so shallow that navigation has become genuinely hazardous. Marty Heddle of American Commercial Barge Line told the Mississippi River Commission's 2024 annual low water inspection meeting that the industry was asking to maintain the navigation channel in the lower Mississippi to a dredged depth of 12 feet between Cairo and Baton Rouge, deeper than the current 9-foot standard, to provide buffer against the low water conditions that now recur annually. His argument, if the channel were 12 feet deep, a drought year that currently forces 9-foot limitations would instead produce 11-foot operating conditions, still below normal, but not crisis territory. The cost of implementing that deeper channel, he noted, is approximately $40 million to maintain in drastic low water conditions, a fraction of the economic losses that recur when the system is not adequately maintained. That recommendation has not been implemented as of 2026. The Army Corps operate under a budget determined by Congress, and the inland waterway infrastructure investment that would make the river system more resilient to the drought pattern, now clearly established as recurrent, has not materialized at the scale the river industry requires. And this is where the story takes the turn that most domestic coverage of the Mississippi River crisis fails to follow. Because the Mississippi River crisis is not just an American supply chain problem. It is a global food supply problem, and the connections between a stalled atmospheric blocking pattern over the Midwest, the depth of the river at Memphis, and the price of bread in importing countries are real, measurable, and documented. Approximately half of all U.S. corn, soybeans, and wheat exports move through the Mississippi River system. The United States is the world's largest exporter of soybeans and corn, the primary feed grain for livestock globally. When American grain cannot reach Gulf export terminals at normal volumes and at competitive prices, the global buyers who depend on those supplies face either price increases or supply shortfalls, or both. The world does not have unlimited alternative suppliers at scale. Brazil, Argentina, and the Black Sea region collectively provide the primary alternatives, and each has its own constraints on how rapidly production can be scaled to replace American supply shortfalls. The 2022 crisis unfolded against a backdrop of global grain market stress that made the timing particularly damaging. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 had disrupted Black Sea grain exports, a major supply source for grain importing countries in North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. Global grain prices were already elevated before the Mississippi crisis compounded the supply shortage. The United Nations Secretary General was, in late summer of 2022, actively negotiating the restoration of Ukrainian grain export routes, an indication of how tight global supplies were, even before the American river system began failing at harvest. Chad Hart at Iowa State University described the competitive impact clearly. When barge rates spike, U.S. grain becomes more expensive at Gulf terminals, and international buyers, for whom the delivered price differential between American grain and Brazilian grain is the deciding factor, will switch suppliers. They do not wait for the Mississippi to recover. They book alternative shipments, establish alternative logistics chains, and sometimes build lasting commercial relationships with alternative suppliers that persist even after American river conditions normalize. The American Soybean Association estimated that during the 2022 crisis, barge transportation accounted for approximately 6% of the delivered cost for soybeans shipped from Davenport, Iowa to Shanghai. A 6% cost increase in a commodity market operating on razor-thin margins is enough to redirect purchasing decisions. The U.S. market share in soybean exports, which had been recovering after the tariff disruptions of 2018 and 2019, was not permanently damaged by 2022, but it was set back, and the repeated disruptions of subsequent years have compounded that setback. Brazil's competitiveness in the global soybean market has been enhanced not just by the Mississippi River's recurring failures, but by substantial Brazilian infrastructure investment over the same decade. The expansion of port facilities at Paranaguá and Santos, the construction of new agricultural highways in Mato Grosso, the heart of Brazilian soybean production, and the improvement of river and rail networks connecting interior production to coastal ports have made Brazil a more reliable supplier in absolute terms, not just a beneficiary of American logistics failures. When buyers experience repeated delivery uncertainty from American supply chains during peak seasons, they build supply relationships with alternative sources not just as short-term hedges, but as long-term strategic positioning. The Mississippi's recurrent low-water events are providing an extended competitive advantage to Brazil that no trade policy negotiation can easily reverse. The fertilizer dimension of the global trade story runs in the opposite direction, upstream rather than downstream in the supply chain. The United States is a net importer of nitrogen fertilizer, with imports arriving at Gulf Coast ports and then moving northward by barge to Midwest agricultural markets. When low water restricts northbound barge capacity, fertilizer import costs rise and availability tightens. The countries that export to the United States, Canada, Russia, Trinidad and Tobago, Morocco, among others, are not directly affected by the Mississippi's depth. But the cost of delivering their product to the Midwest farmer who needs it is directly determined by what the river is doing. A fertilizer market disruption that raises input costs for American farmers simultaneously occurs with an export market disruption that lowers the revenue from the crop those inputs are growing. The compound squeeze is an agricultural finance crisis experienced one farm at a time, spread across tens of thousands of operations in a dozen states.
There is also a food security dimension that extends beyond commodity markets to the populations most vulnerable to price increases in staple foods. In countries where cornmeal, soybean oil, and wheat flour represent significant shares of household food spending, a 5 or 10% increase in import prices, driven by American river transport constraints, translates directly into reduced caloric access for families with limited purchasing flexibility. The global food system is interconnected tightly enough that a drought over Missouri and Indiana registers eventually in household budgets in Egypt and Indonesia.
The 9-foot navigable channel from Minneapolis to Baton Rouge does not maintain itself. It exists because of over a century of federal engineering investment and ongoing Army Corps of Engineers management, a continuous program of dredging, lock maintenance, bank stabilization, and hydrological monitoring that is the physical infrastructure underlying the entire barge transportation system. The Army Corps of Engineers maintenance of the Mississippi River Navigation Channel is authorized under the Flood Control Act of 1944 and subsequent water resources development legislation. The Corps maintains 29 locks and dams on the upper Mississippi alone, operating them around the clock to provide the water control necessary for navigation on a river whose natural flow varies enormously by season and year. The locks step the river down in elevation from Minneapolis' altitude of approximately 800 feet above sea level to the sea level mouth at the Gulf of Mexico, a descent managed in a series of engineered steps that allow barges to transit the full length of the river without encountering falls or rapids that would block navigation. Dredging is the Corps' primary tool for managing the effects of low water on the navigation channel. When the river's flow is insufficient to maintain the authorized 9-foot depth across the channel's full 300-foot width, sediment accumulates on the bottom and sides, creating shoals, shallow areas where barges risk grounding. The Corps deploys hopper dredges, specialized vessels that excavate bottom sediment and carry it to disposal sites, to remove the shoals and restore depth. During extreme low-water events like those of 2022, 2023, and the current period, the Corps operates dredges 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, across multiple problem locations simultaneously. The dredging operation is a physical choreography of remarkable scale. Hopper dredges, some of the most specialized vessels in the federal fleet, excavate material from the river bottom, fill their hoppers with the dredged sediment, transport it to approved disposal sites either in the river's side channels or on adjacent floodplain disposal areas, and return for the next load. The process continues until the survey vessels, equipped with precision depth-sounding sonar, confirm that the channel has been restored to the authorized depth. During active crises, survey vessels run continuous depth surveys along the critical reaches, updating navigation charts daily or more frequently to reflect the locations where the river is safe for commercial navigation and where restrictions remain in place. The Corps' operations during the 2022 crisis illustrated the scale of what extreme low-water management demands. The Corps suspended dredging temporarily at multiple locations when safety conditions for dredge operations became questionable. The same shallow water that was restricting barges was also restricting the deep draft dredges. They coordinated with Coast Guard District 8 in New Orleans to establish convoy protocols, escorted movement of loaded barge tows through the most restricted sections with the Coast Guard, directing traffic to prevent groundings that could block the channel entirely. A single grounded barge in a narrow, shallow section can plug the river's commercial traffic for days, the time required to refloat it, clear the channel, and restore safe navigation for following tows. Marty Heddle of American Commercial Barge Line, testifying to the Mississippi River Commission at its 2024 annual inspection, estimated the cost of maintaining a 12-foot channel, drastic low-water conditions at approximately $40 million, the incremental cost above normal maintenance. He framed this as a worthwhile investment against losses that can reach into the tens of billions. The Corps' total navigation mission budget for the inland waterways system is a fraction of what the system generates in economic value. The political challenge is not the economics. It is the annual appropriations process, which does not easily translate multi-year compound event risks into single-year budget authorizations. The 2022 crisis produced a specific infrastructure challenge that the Corps had not previously managed at this scale. The need to keep a channel open through a river section where the water was genuinely historically shallow. Near Stack Island, Mississippi, a navigation choke point in the lower river, the Corps suspended dredging temporarily when conditions became too hazardous for dredge operations, effectively closing that section of the river to commercial navigation for a period. During the closure, more than 2,000 barges backed up at various points along the river system, waiting for safe passage. The Coast Guard coordinated with the Corps and with barge operators to establish priority movement protocols and convoy operations to move the most critical cargo through the restricted sections first. It worked, eventually, but the days of closure had economic consequences that ripple through the supply chain for weeks after the channel reopens. The locks and dams of the upper Mississippi River are among the most economically important and most age-compromised pieces of infrastructure in the United States. The 29 lock and dam structures on the upper Mississippi were built primarily between 1930 and 1940 during the Depression-era public works programs that modernized American infrastructure. They were designed with a service life of 50 years. They are now 90 years old. The lock chambers, concrete structures that hold and release water to lift or lower barges as they transit the elevation changes of the upper river, have developed cracks, concrete spalling, deteriorating gate machinery, and failing hydraulic systems that require constant maintenance to keep operational. The main gate mechanisms on several locks are decades past their intended replacement dates and are sustained by heroic maintenance efforts rather than designed-in reliability. The consequences of lock failures are not theoretical. When a lock goes out of service for emergency repairs, as has happened multiple times in recent years at various locations on the upper river, all commercial navigation through that lock stops. A single lock failure on the upper Mississippi can back up barge traffic for days or weeks, with cascading effects on the downstream river sections that depend on a continuous flow of barges from the upper system. The delays compound during low water periods, when navigation is already slower and more complex, and when the Corps' dredging resources are already stretched. The American Society of Civil Engineers has consistently graded the inland waterways infrastructure at a D in its report card on American infrastructure, a grade that reflects the combination of aging physical structures, deferred maintenance backlog, and inadequate investment relative to the system's economic importance. The infrastructure gap is quantifiable. The waterways user community has been advocating for increased investment through the Inland Waterways Trust Fund, funded by a fuel tax paid by barge operators, but the authorized projects in the queue significantly exceed available funding, and the construction backlog grows each year that the highest priority projects are not funded and built. The Upper Mississippi River Lock Modernization Program, a congressionally authorized effort to replace the aging lock chambers at several critical upper river locations with new, larger chambers capable of handling modern tow sizes more efficiently, has been funded and constructed at multiple sites. But the program has proceeded more slowly than the aging of the existing infrastructure, and several critical sites remain on the old equipment. The most important of these is Locks and Dam 25 near Winona, Minnesota, and the cluster of locks in the St. Louis area, where traffic volumes are highest and the economic impact of any service interruption is greatest. During the low water events of the past 4 years, the Corps has been operating aging locks at extreme load while simultaneously managing the dredging crisis in the lower river. Two simultaneous demands on an organization that has been asked to do more with a budget that has not grown commensurately with the infrastructure challenges it faces. The question of whether rail can substitute for river during a Mississippi crisis deserves a detailed answer, because the standard framing, shippers can divert to rail, obscures more than it reveals. The U.S. Freight Railroad Network is the largest in the world by route miles, an extraordinary piece of national infrastructure that carries freight with high efficiency across enormous distances. The Class 1 railroads, BNSF, Union Pacific, CSX, Norfolk Southern, and their peers, operate sophisticated logistics networks with sophisticated revenue management systems designed to optimize the allocation of capacity across hundreds of different freight types and hundreds of thousands of origin-destination pairs simultaneously. Grain is one of the largest freight categories by volume on American railroads, and the rail system does move substantial grain volumes even in normal years, serving producers far from the river system, moving grain to Pacific Northwest ports for export to Asia, and filling the gaps that barge transport does not cover. In normal market conditions, rail and barge complement each other, with each filling the niches where its economics are most favorable. During a river crisis, that complementary relationship is disrupted by a surge demand that the rail system cannot easily accommodate without significant service disruption to other freight categories. The rail network has fixed physical capacity, a finite number of track miles, a finite number of locomotives, a finite number of hopper cars capable of carrying grain. In 2022, as the Midwest grain harvest proceeded at normal volume while the river ran shallow, grain shippers who turned to rail found a system that was already operating at or near capacity and that faced its own labor and service challenges. The freight railroad industry in 2022 was simultaneously managing the aftermath of a dramatic workforce reduction during the COVID period, implementing new operating plans that had reduced crew sizes and changed how trains were assembled and dispatched, and facing a potential nationwide railroad strike that was ultimately averted only by congressional intervention in December 2022. The combination meant that the system's spare capacity, the buffer that would normally absorb diverted river freight, was minimal. Car order fulfillment times stretched. Rates rose. Service reliability declined. The grain that did divert to rail in 2022 did reach its destination eventually, but it arrived later than planned, at higher cost, with more uncertainty, and through a system that was visibly stressed by the additional demand. The food and agricultural supply chains that depend on the predictability of the logistics system, the ethanol plants that need corn deliveries on schedule, the poultry and livestock operations that need feed deliveries timed to animal feeding programs, the export elevators that need grain arrivals timed to vessel loading schedules, absorb those stresses in the form of higher costs, higher inventory carry, and some service failures. The trucking alternative faces an even harder capacity constraint. The American trucking industry has been managing a structural driver shortage for years, a shortage that industry analysts have estimated at 60,000 to 80,000 drivers below the level needed to fulfill available freight demand at peak periods. Grain transport is a seasonal demand surge that concentrates its peak in October, November, and December, exactly when other freight categories are also at their seasonal peak. The grain-capable truck trailers and the drivers to operate them are not sitting idle waiting to replace river capacity. They are fully deployed serving their normal freight categories, and adding river-diverted grain volume to their load would require either pulling them from other freight, displacing those supply chains, or going without, which means grain simply not moving. Before we move to the assessment of what the current crisis means and where it is headed, I want to address directly a pair of explanatory framings that circulate around Mississippi River coverage that obscure more than they illuminate. The first is the claim that the river crisis is primarily a failure of federal infrastructure investment, that if the Army Corps had more money and the locks were newer, the low water crisis would not exist. This is a genuine concern about a real infrastructure gap, but it conflates two different problems. The Army Corps' aging infrastructure and the inland waterways investment shortfall are real issues with real economic consequences, and Marty Heddle's argument for a deeper authorized channel has genuine merit. But a 12-foot channel instead of a 9-foot channel would provide more buffer against low water disruption. It would not solve a drought severe enough to drop the Memphis gauge to minus 11 feet. The river's depth is determined by the water flowing in it. When the Ohio River is contributing 8% of normal flow, no authorized channel depth solves the physics. Infrastructure investment is important and necessary. It is not a substitute for water. The second framing is that the crisis is primarily a trade policy failure, that the loss of American grain market share to Brazil and Argentina during river crises reflects policy decisions about trade barriers, tariffs, or agricultural subsidies rather than the logistics of a river running too shallow. This framing is incorrect in the short run. When the Memphis gauge reads minus 11 feet during the harvest, American grain loses competitiveness because it is physically more expensive to move to a ship, not because of any policy variable. The trade policy context matters for the medium and long run. The ongoing renegotiation of agricultural trade relationships creates the background against which buyers make their sourcing decisions. But it does not explain the immediate price spike and export disruption that follows a severe low water event. The river is running shallow because the Midwest has not gotten enough rain to sustain the flow of the Ohio River, which is the primary source of the lower Mississippi's water. The Ohio River is running at 8% of normal contribution because a persistent atmospheric blocking ridge has parked over the region, deflecting storm tracks and suppressing convection for months. The atmospheric blocking is occurring with unusual frequency and persistence compared to the historical record, in ways that atmospheric scientists at the University of Missouri and elsewhere have connected to the larger scale circulation changes associated with Arctic amplification and the shifting of the mid-latitude jet stream.
The real story is a compound one, a physical infrastructure system, the river and its locks, that was built to a specification that assumed a certain hydrological environment, operating in a hydrological environment that is shifting away from those design assumptions. The response to that compound reality requires both infrastructure investment and a clear-eyed understanding of the atmospheric forcing that is making the problem recurrent.
The honest assessment of the current Mississippi River low water crisis requires presenting three interpretations of what the available evidence means, presented in order from most favorable to least, and with an honest assessment of which the data most supports. Interpretation 1. The current crisis is severe but contained within the range of outcomes the agricultural and transportation system has learned to manage through the experience of 2022, 2023, 2024, and 2025. Barge operators now plan for drought conditions as a baseline rather than an exception. Farmers have diversified their marketing strategies, expanding local connections, selling to regional processors, timing their sales to avoid the worst of the low water period. Rail and truck alternatives, while expensive, are better understood and better organized than in 2022. The Army Corps' dredging program is pre-positioned and operational before conditions reach crisis levels, rather than scrambling to catch up. Under this interpretation, the 2026 crisis inflicts real economic costs, elevated barge rates, lower farm income, reduced export competitiveness, but does not produce the emergency. Closures and 2,000 barge backups that marked the 2022 event. The system has adapted. The losses are real but managed. This interpretation has genuine supporting evidence. The barge industry and the agricultural logistics community have spent 4 years learning to operate in drought-normal conditions. Steenhoek at the Soy Transportation Coalition has articulated strategies for managing the crop marketing calendar around anticipated river constraints. Grain elevators have adjusted their buying and hedging programs to account for drought period basis deterioration. The Army Corps has refined its dredging protocols and pre-positioned equipment. The crisis communications between the Corps, Coast Guard, commodity groups, and barge operators have improved with each successive event. These are real adaptations with real consequences for how the crisis develops. Interpretation 2. The current crisis, while not reaching the acute closure conditions of 2022, is structurally more damaging than the adapted response framework acknowledges because it is arriving as the fourth year of a compounding situation. The cumulative effect of 4 consecutive years of below normal barge throughput during harvest season is not equivalent to 4 independent disruptions that have been separately managed and resolved. It is a sustained compression of the export pipeline that has gradually shifted market share, investor confidence in the inland waterway system, and farmer marketing strategies in ways that will persist even when normal river conditions return. The harm is being measured year by year, but it is accumulating across years in ways that the year-by-year analysis misses. Under this interpretation, the economic damage of the current year is substantial even if it does not produce the dramatic surface indicators of 2022, and the institutional legitimacy of the inland waterway as a reliable export corridor is eroding in ways that will be costly to restore. Interpretation 3. The current crisis is a data point in a trend that represents a fundamental shift in the hydrological reliability of the Mississippi River system as a transportation infrastructure. The atmospheric blocking pattern that drives the drought is becoming more persistent. The NOAA Spring 2026 outlook forecasted drought expansion into the Midwest and below normal precipitation probability for the April through June period across the region. El Niño conditions, assessed at 85 to 94% probability by late April 2026, tend to produce warmer and drier conditions in the northern Midwest during summer, compounding the blocking-driven precipitation deficit. If the drought pattern persists through the summer growing season and into the fall harvest period, the 2026 crisis will be more severe than the 2025 crisis, not because any specific weather event is dramatically different, but because the cumulative soil moisture deficit and the reduced runoff from a summer of insufficient rainfall will produce lower Ohio River contributions than even the recent drought years have seen. Under this interpretation, the system is getting worse, not cycling through manageable disruptions to normal operation. The evidence most strongly supports Interpretation 2, with the elements of Interpretation 3 that relate to the documented trend in atmospheric blocking, and Ohio River flow contribution, representing genuine risk rather than speculation. The evidence is clear enough to state plainly. What the data establishes, the Mississippi River at Memphis has fallen below the zero reference level during harvest season in 8 of the last 10 years. The gauge has reached the -5-foot low water threshold 5 times since 2015. The historical record low at Memphis was set in 2022 at -10.79 feet, surpassed in 2023 at -11.52 feet, a new record since systematic record keeping began. What the data establishes: the Ohio River, which normally contributes 50% of the lower Mississippi's total flow, was contributing 8% as of September 2025, the most recent severe drought period. Long-term precipitation deficits of 8 to 16 inches over 12 months across Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, and southern Iowa were documented by NOAA's Climate Prediction Center in its March 2026 Drought Status Update. These deficits are the hydrological fingerprint of the atmospheric blocking pattern that University of Missouri researchers have documented as the primary driver of Midwest drought in multiple recent years. What the data establishes: when river depth falls to crisis levels, grain barge rates reach multiples of their normal values, 3,000% of tariff in 2022, 2,000% in 2023. The economic damage from the 2022 event alone was assessed at approximately $20 billion in lost U.S. economic output. Agricultural export losses through Louisiana ports were $565 million in the second half of 2022 alone. Soybean basis deterioration in drought years consistently runs 15 to 41 cents below non-drought averages in markets bordering the river. What the data establishes: the alternative transport systems, rail and trucking, cannot absorb river freight diversion at full scale without significant service degradation and cost increases across their entire networks, due to the scale mismatch between barge capacity and rail and truck capacity, and due to the existing capacity constraints in both industries. What the data establishes: the infrastructure maintaining the navigation channel, the Army Corps dredging program, and the aging lock and dam system is operating at the limit of its capacity and budget during low water emergencies, and the industry's request for a deeper authorized channel and accelerated lock modernization has not been funded at the scale and pace the frequency of the current disruption justifies. What the data does not establish: whether the current 2026 drought at the time of this investigation will reach the severity of 2022 and 2023, or remain in the elevated but not record territory of 2025. That determination depends on how the summer precipitation pattern evolves, whether the atmospheric blocking ridge over the Midwest breaks and allows normal summer convection to resume, or whether it persists through the growing season and compounds the existing soil moisture deficit into an unprecedented multi-year cumulative drought. What the data does not establish: the precise dollar magnitude of this year's damage, since that number accumulates through the fall harvest season and is not fully calculable until the winter shipping data is complete. The Mississippi River crisis is, at its core, a collision between infrastructure designed for one climate regime and operations now conducted in a different one. The navigation channel, the lock and dam system, the grain elevator infrastructure along the river's banks, the barge fleet, the Gulf port complex, all of it was designed around a hydrological assumption that the Mississippi River and its tributaries would, on average, maintain flows sufficient for commercial navigation through the harvest season, with severe low water events being rare. Exceptions separated by years of normal conditions. The 8 of 10-year drought season record is evidence that this assumption is no longer reliable. The atmospheric blocking pattern is more persistent. The soil moisture deficit entering drought events is more severe because the background warming that has occurred since the infrastructure was built has increased evapotranspiration rates and reduced the soil moisture buffer that moderates how quickly rivers respond to precipitation deficits. The response framework that the river system currently employs, dredge during crises, urge conservation, wait for rain, is adequate for occasional disruptions. It is not adequate for a pattern that now appears structural. 4 consecutive years is not a streak, it is a trend, and a trend requires a different response than a streak. The industry's response requests are specific and quantifiable. Heddle's argument for a 12-foot authorized channel between Cairo and Baton Rouge addresses the buffer problem directly. A deeper channel means that a drought year producing -7 feet at Memphis, which would be a significant crisis under the 9-foot standard, instead produces navigable conditions with modest restrictions under a 12-foot standard. The cost of implementing this, approximately $40 million in drastic low water conditions, is a rounding error relative to the $20 billion economic damage of the 2022 event. But the channel depth argument also contains a limit. Dredging creates a deeper channel by removing sediment from the bottom. In extreme low water conditions, the water table and the sediment dynamics interact in ways that make maintaining an artificially deepened channel increasingly difficult the more severe the drought becomes. At minus 11 feet at Memphis, the territory of the 2023 record, even a 12-foot authorized channel would be stressed. The infrastructure solution supplements the water. It does not replace it. The lock modernization program addresses a related but distinct problem. Aging locks that fail unexpectedly add supply chain disruption on top of weather-driven disruption, compounding the already stressed system. The lock modernization projects that are authorized but unfunded represent a known solvable infrastructure problem with a known calculable economic benefit. The political calculus that has left them underfunded for decades is not a technical problem. It is an institutional one, the challenge of convincing annual appropriations processes to invest in infrastructure that prevents a problem rather than responding to one. The Inland Waterways Trust Fund, the mechanism through which barge operators pay a per-gallon fuel tax to contribute to waterway infrastructure improvements, is a user-pay financing system that in principle aligns infrastructure investment with the industries that benefit from it. In practice, the trust fund has been chronically under-resourced relative to the authorized project backlog. The new cost-share ratio established in recent Water Resources Development Act legislation, federal government covering 75% of project costs, with barge operators covering 25% through the fuel tax, represents an improvement over the prior 50-50 split and has enabled some project acceleration. But the pipeline of authorized but unfunded projects remains long, and the projects at the front of that pipeline, the lock modernizations at the highest traffic, highest economic impact locations, are still years from completion at current funding rates. The broader logistics resilience question, how to build a Midwest agricultural export system that is genuinely resilient to recurrent low water periods, is more complex and more expensive. It ultimately requires a combination of infrastructure investment on the river, alternative export infrastructure development at Pacific and East Coast ports, and logistics planning that allows grain elevators and farmers to adjust their marketing timing more flexibly in response to river conditions. Some of this is happening. The Soy Transportation Coalitions work with farmers on alternative marketing strategies is one example. The advocacy for expanded export infrastructure at Pacific Northwest ports as an alternative to Gulf-only export dependence is another. But the scale of these alternatives is limited relative to the volume that moves through the Gulf, and building them to scale is a decades-long project. There is also an agricultural land use dimension to the long-term resilience question. Much of the farmland in the Mississippi Basin was drained of its historical wetland character, tile drained to make fields suitable for row crop production. Those wetlands, when they existed, moderated the hydrological extremes that the basin now experiences, retaining water during wet periods and releasing it slowly during dry periods, buffering both floods and droughts. The restoration of wetland functions in the upper basin would not solve the atmospheric blocking problem, but it would moderate the speed at which precipitation deficits translate into river flow deficits. Conservation programs that support wetland restoration, cover cropping, and improved soil moisture retention are not just ecological investments. They are hydrological investments with direct economic returns in the form of reduced river shipping disruptions. Making that case to agricultural policy audiences, connecting the dots between conservation practices and freight rates, is a communication challenge that the agricultural economics community has been working on but has not yet fully solved. This investigation will not end when the Mississippi River rises. The pattern it has documented is not a weather event. It is a systematic, recurring, structurally driven challenge to the most important freight corridor in the Western Hemisphere. And the resolution of that challenge requires decisions that will be made or not made over the next several years. The metrics that matter going forward are specific. The National Weather Service Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center publishes river stage forecasts for key gauge locations: Memphis, Cairo, Natchez, New Orleans, on a rolling 28-day basis. Those forecasts, combined with the upstream precipitation pattern documented by NOAA's daily drought monitor, will determine whether the 2026 low water period remains in the elevated but manageable range or approaches the record low territory of 2022 and 2023. The USDA Agricultural Marketing Service publishes weekly barge movement data and freight rate reports. The Grain Transportation Report, that track grain volumes moving by barge, by rail, and by truck. Those reports translate the river gauge readings into economic reality. The rate per ton, the volume shortfall compared to historical averages, the accumulating basis deterioration at river elevators. They are the most direct measure of how the crisis is developing economically. The Army Corps of Engineers daily dredging operations report tracks where the Corps is working and what channel depths it is maintaining. When dredging becomes continuous at multiple locations simultaneously, the crisis is acute. When dredging can be reduced and concentrated at isolated problem spots, the system is managing. The Corps' website publishes this information, and the commodity groups and barge operators who depend on it monitor it constantly. The September 2025 Drought Status Update from drought.gov captured the Ohio River's contribution at 8% of normal, the number that determined the river's behavior downstream. That contribution percentage, tracked through the next update cycle, will tell us whether upstream conditions are improving or deteriorating. The Ohio is the governor of the lower Mississippi. Its recovery determines everything downstream. Mike Steenhoek at the Soy Transportation Coalition, Chad Hart at Iowa State, Hunter Byram at the University of Arkansas, and the atmospheric scientists at the University of Missouri tracking the blocking pattern. These are the voices whose analysis this channel will follow as the story develops. They are the people who have been watching this system longest, who understand its dynamics most precisely, and who communicate its significance with the specificity that the story requires. The Mississippi River is the artery that connects American agriculture to the world. When it runs shallow, the American farm economy bleeds, slowly, numerically, in the basis calculations of farmers who get less for their crop, and in the freight invoices of shippers who pay more to move less. That bleeding is not dramatic in the way that a hurricane or a flood is dramatic. But it is real, it is cumulative, and across 4 consecutive years, it has cost the American economy tens of billions of dollars, and cost the farmers who supply the world with its grain hundreds of millions in diminished income. The river is the story that runs beneath the news, the story that explains why fertilizer costs more, why grain prices fluctuate in ways that seem disconnected from weather at the farm level, why the United States is gradually less competitive in global grain markets despite producing record harvests. The river is shallow, and the rain that should fill it is not falling, and the atmosphere above the Midwest is parked in a configuration that keeps the storm tracks away. We will be watching the gauges, we will be tracking the freight rates, we will be following the dredging operations and the crop marketing reports and the drought monitor updates. When the river rises, we will tell you. When it falls further, we will tell you that too. And when the decisions about infrastructure investment and logistics resilience are made or deferred, we will tell you what they mean for the next time and the time after that. The 2022 crisis produced 2,000 stranded barges, emergency dredging around the clock, force majeure declarations from the largest barge operator in the country, and $20 billion in estimated economic losses. The 2023 crisis broke the previous year's record low-gauge reading at Memphis. The 2024 and 2025 events continued the pattern without relenting. And now, in 2026, the drought monitor across Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, and southern Iowa shows 8 to 16 inches of precipitation deficit over the preceding 12 months. The spring outlook from NOAA's Climate Prediction Center shows below normal precipitation probability for the region, and El Niño conditions are assessed at 85% or higher probability through summer. All of the inputs are pointing in the same direction. The Mississippi does not run dry dramatically, it recedes. Slowly, incrementally, foot by foot below the zero line until the sandbars emerge, and the channel narrows and the tows slow and the rates climb and the basis falls, and the farmer gets less for a harvest that costs just as much to produce. The river is the country's freight backbone. When it fails, the country pays in every grocery store, in every gas station, in every export cargo that leaves for somewhere else.
The Mississippi is not just a river. It is a decision that the American economy makes every day about whether the infrastructure of its agricultural system will function as designed. Right now, it is barely functioning, and the decisions about what to do about that, the budget decisions, the infrastructure investment decisions, the logistics resilience decisions, are still pending. We'll be here when they're made, and we'll tell you exactly what they mean.